The grand ballroom of Kensington Palace sparkled under the light of crystal chandeliers, their warm glow casting dancing shadows across the polished marble floors. Tonight was different from the usual state dinners and formal receptions that filled the royal calendar. This evening was dedicated to celebrating the arts, specifically classical music, and the palace had invited some of the world's most distinguished musicians to perform for the royal family and their guests. Among the invited performers was Alexander Petrov, a Russian pianist whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. At 35, he had already conquered the world's most prestigious concert halls, from Carnegie Hall to the Royal Opera House. His fingers could coax magic from piano keys, creating melodies that moved audiences to tears and earning him critical acclaim that bordered on worship. Petrov was known not just for his extraordinary talent, but also for his sharp tongue and unwavering belief that classical music was a sacred art form that shouldn't be diluted by amateur enthusiasts, regardless of their social standing. Prince William, now in his 40s and bearing the weight of future kingship on his shoulders, had always found solace in music. Unlike his public duties that required careful consideration of every word and gesture, music offered him a private sanctuary where he could express emotions that royal protocol often demanded he keep hidden. As a child, he had learned piano from some of the finest instructors in Britain, though his lessons had often been interrupted by royal obligations and public appearances. His love for the instrument had never wavered, but his skill had remained largely private, known only to family members and a few close friends. The evening began with a reception where guests mingled over champagne and canapés. Prince William moved through the crowd with practiced ease, engaging in polite conversation about everything from recent charitable endeavors to upcoming royal tours. His wife Catherine stood beside him, radiant in a midnight blue gown, gracefully handling her own circle of admirers and well-wishers. The atmosphere was relaxed yet respectful, filled with the gentle murmur of cultured voices and occasional bursts of refined laughter. Alexander Petrov stood near the grand piano that dominated one corner of the ballroom, surrounded by fellow musicians and music critics who hung on his every word. He was a striking figure, tall and lean with sharp features and piercing dark eyes that seemed to evaluate everything and everyone around him with intense scrutiny. His black hair was swept back from his forehead, and he wore his formal evening wear with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. The problem with music today, Petrov was saying to his captivated audience, his voice carrying a slight Russian accent that only added to his mystique, is that too many people believe they can simply pick up an instrument and call themselves musicians. Music is not a hobby for the wealthy or a party trick for the privileged. It requires dedication, sacrifice, and, above all, genuine talent. One of the music critics, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, nodded thoughtfully. But surely you believe music should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their background? Petrov's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Accessible, yes. But that doesn't mean everyone should presume to perform it, especially not in front of those who have dedicated their lives to mastering their craft. There's a difference between appreciation and appropriation. As if summoned by the controversial nature of the conversation, several guests began drifting toward the group, drawn by Petrov's magnetic presence and provocative statements. Among them was Lord Ashworth, an elderly gentleman who had served as patron to numerous musical organizations throughout his life. "Mr. Petrov," Lord Ashworth interjected with a slight smile, "I hope you're not suggesting that those born to privilege cannot also possess genuine musical talent?" Petrov turned his penetrating gaze toward the older man, his expression remaining carefully neutral. "I'm suggesting that talent and privilege are not synonymous, Lord Ashworth. True artistry comes from struggle, from the desperate need to express something that cannot be contained. Those who have never known want, who have never felt the burning necessity to create or starve, often mistake technical competence for artistic soul." The conversation was beginning to draw more attention, and several guests found themselves caught between fascination and discomfort. This was, after all, a royal gathering, and such pointed remarks about privilege and authenticity carried weight that went far beyond mere musical theory. Prince William, who had been engaged in conversation across the room, became aware of the growing tension. His training in diplomacy had taught him to recognize when a social situation was approaching dangerous territory, and something about the energy near the piano was setting off quiet alarm bells. He excused himself from his current conversation and began moving toward the group, Catherine following a step behind. As they approached, Petrov's voice became clearer. Take royal patronage of the arts, for example. While I appreciate the financial support and recognition it provides, we must be honest about the difference between being a patron and being a practitioner. Supporting music is admirable, but it doesn't qualify one to perform it at this level. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, and several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Everyone present was acutely aware that Prince William was known to play piano, though few had heard him perform outside of private family gatherings. Prince William reached the edge of the group just as Petrov was warming to his theme. I've seen too many wealthy dilettantes who believe that expensive lessons and quality instruments can substitute for genuine talent and years of serious study. They play in their drawing rooms for appreciative friends and family, receiving polite applause that convinces them they possess abilities they simply don't have. That seems rather harsh, ventured a young woman who worked for one of London's major orchestras. Surely the joy of music making has value even if one isn't destined for professional performance? Petrov's smile was sharp as a blade. Joy is subjective, but standards are not. When someone who dabbles in music performs alongside professionals, it diminishes the art form. It's like asking a weekend painter to display their work beside a Monet. Prince William found himself directly behind the pianist now, close enough to hear every word clearly. He had intended to simply observe and, perhaps steer the conversation toward more neutral territory, but something about Petrov's absolute certainty and dismissive tone sparked a reaction he hadn't expected. That's an interesting perspective, Prince William said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation around them. Petrov turned, and, for a moment, his expression shifted as he recognized who had spoken. But, rather than showing deference or embarrassment, his features settled into a look of polite condescension. "Your Royal Highness," he said with a precise bow. "I hope you don't find my observations too blunt. I believe in honest discourse about the arts." "Not at all," William replied, his tone remaining even. "Though I wonder if you might be painting with rather broad strokes. Surely talent can emerge from unexpected places?" Petrov's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Certainly, Your Highness. Though in my experience, true musical talent makes itself known early and demands to be nurtured through serious, dedicated study. It cannot be achieved through casual interest or occasional lessons, no matter how expensive or well-intentioned they might be." The assembled guests had fallen silent now, sensing the undercurrent of tension in what appeared to be a polite exchange. Catherine moved closer to her husband's side, her expression neutral but alert. "You speak as if dedication and serious study are incompatible with other obligations," William observed. "Perhaps you underestimate people's ability to pursue excellence in multiple areas of their lives." "Perhaps," Petrov conceded with a slight shrug. "Though I've found that music demands exclusivity of passion. It's jealous art that doesn't suffer divided attention kindly. Those with other responsibilities often find themselves capable of competence but not artistry." The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. Every person in the group understood that Petrov was essentially dismissing the possibility that someone with royal duties could also possess genuine musical ability. Lord Ashworth cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Petrov, I think perhaps—" "No, please," William interrupted gently, his eyes never leaving the pianist's face. "I find Mr. Petrov's views fascinating. Tell me, how exactly do you measure this exclusivity of passion? Is it purely a matter of time spent at the instrument, or are there other factors?" Petrov seemed to realize that he had maneuvered himself into delicate territory, but, rather than retreating, he doubled down on his position. "Time is certainly a factor, Your Highness. But, more importantly, it's about the willingness to sacrifice everything else for the music. The great musicians I know have given up comfort, security, social pleasures, everything that might distract from their art. They've lived in tiny apartments, eaten simple meals, and spent every waking moment either practicing or thinking about music. And, you believe this suffering is necessary for artistry?" William asked, his voice still quiet but carrying a note that made Catherine glance at him with concern. "Not suffering, exactly," Petrov replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of this distinction. "Commitment. absolute, unwavering commitment to the music above all else. When someone has never had to choose between comfort and their art, when they've never felt the desperation of needing to create something beautiful just to feel alive, how can they understand what music truly means? The silence that followed was deafening. Even the conversations happening elsewhere in the ballroom seemed to have quieted, as if the entire room had somehow sensed the tension building near the piano. Prince William studied Petrov's face for a long moment, his own expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an authority that reminded everyone present exactly who they were addressing. "That's a very romantic notion of artistry, Mr. Petrov. Though I wonder if you might be confusing struggle with authenticity. Perhaps true musical understanding comes not from what one lacks, but from what one feels, regardless of the circumstances of their life." Petrov's eyebrows rose slightly. "With respect, Your Highness, feeling without technical mastery and years of dedicated practice is simply enthusiasm. Admirable, perhaps, but not art." The gauntlet had been thrown down, and everyone present felt it. Catherine's hand found her husband's arm, a gentle touch that spoke of both support and caution. Lord Ashworth looked as if he might faint, while the other guests remained frozen in fascination and horror at the direction the conversation had taken. Prince William looked at the grand piano, its polished black surface reflecting the chandelier light like still water. When he turned back to Petrov, there was something new in his expression, not anger, but a quiet determination that those who knew him well would have recognized as dangerous. "You make compelling arguments," he said finally. "Though I suspect you might be underestimating the depth of feeling that can exist alongside other obligations. But, please, don't let our conversation interrupt your evening. I believe you were scheduled to perform for us?" It was a masterful deflection, giving Petrov the opportunity to step away from what had become an increasingly uncomfortable exchange. But, instead of accepting the graceful exit, the pianist seemed to interpret the comment as a challenge. "Indeed, I am honored to play for you tonight," Petrov said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I hope you'll appreciate the difference between professional performance and recreational music making." The words were a direct provocation, and everyone present knew it. Prince William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. "I'm certain your performance will be enlightening," he replied. "Music has a way of revealing things we might not otherwise understand about both the performer and the listener." As if by some unspoken signal, the crowd began to shift toward the arranged seating for the evening's performance. Petrov moved to the piano bench with fluid confidence, his earlier conversation apparently forgotten as he prepared to demonstrate exactly what he meant by professional artistry. Prince William and Catherine took their seats in the front row, surrounded by the evening's other distinguished guests. As Petrov's fingers found the keys and the first notes of Chopin's Piano Sonata No. 2 filled the ballroom, the prince found himself listening not just to the music, but to the subtle message being delivered through every perfectly executed phrase. The performance was flawless, technically brilliant, and emotionally compelling. Petrov's hands moved across the keyboard with supernatural precision, drawing sounds from the instrument that seemed to bypass the ear and speak directly to the soul. The funeral march movement brought tears to several listeners' eyes, while the final presto seemed to chase away shadows with its brilliant energy. When the last note faded into silence, the applause was immediate and thunderous. Petrov rose from the bench with a slight bow, his expression suggesting that he had simply confirmed what everyone should have already known about the difference between true artistry and amateur dabbling. As the formal portion of the evening concluded and guests began to mingle again, Prince William remained in his seat for a moment longer than necessary, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Catherine leaned close to speak quietly in his ear. "He's very talented," she murmured, though her tone suggested this wasn't necessarily a compliment in the current context. "Yes," William replied, his voice equally quiet. "He is." But, as he rose and began moving through the crowd, acknowledging the compliments about the evening and the performance, those closest to him could see that something had shifted. The careful diplomacy that usually characterized his public interactions had given way to something more focused, more determined. The evening was far from over, and Alexander Petrov had no idea that his dismissive words about royal dilettantes had awakened something in Prince William that would soon change the course of the entire gathering. The pianist had made his point about the difference between professional artistry and amateur enthusiasm, but he was about to learn that assumptions about privilege and talent could be far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The reception following Alexander Petrov's performance continued with the usual mixture of polite conversation and genuine admiration for the evening's music. Guests clustered in small groups, discussing everything from the technical brilliance of the Chopin interpretation to upcoming cultural events in London's social calendar. The pianist himself held court near the piano, graciously accepting compliments while maintaining the slightly aloof demeanor that had become his trademark. Prince William moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but those who knew him well could detect a subtle tension in his manner. Catherine noticed at first the way his responses to conversations seemed slightly distracted, as if part of his attention was focused elsewhere. Lord Ashworth, still recovering from the earlier exchange between the prince and pianist, attempted to engage William in discussion about an upcoming charity concert, but found his comments met with polite but brief acknowledgments. The truth was that Petrov's dismissive words had struck deeper than anyone realized. William had spent his entire life balancing public duty with personal interests, often forced to set aside things he loved in service to the crown. His musical education had been interrupted countless times by state functions, royal tours, and ceremonial obligations. Yet through it all, he had maintained his love for the piano, practicing when he could find stolen moments between official engagements. What Petrov couldn't have known was that William's relationship with music went far beyond casual interest or royal patronage. As a young boy, grieving the loss of his mother, he had found comfort in the piano's keys when words failed him. The instrument had become his confidant during the difficult teenage years when the weight of future kingship began to settle on his shoulders. During his military service, he had sought out pianos in officers' clubs and military installations, playing late into the night when stress and responsibility threatened to overwhelm him. His instructors over the years had not been merely expensive tutors hired to provide a royal education in the arts. They had been accomplished musicians who recognized genuine talent and passion when they encountered it. Professor Margaret Henley, his longest-serving teacher, had once told him that he possessed not just technical skill, but the rare ability to communicate emotion through music in a way that transcended mere notes on a page. But, tonight, in front of one of the world's most celebrated pianists, all of that seemed to matter less than the social circumstances of his birth. Petrov had made it clear that he viewed William as nothing more than a wealthy dilettante playing at artistry, someone whose privilege made genuine musical understanding impossible. As the evening progressed, William found himself drawn back to the piano area repeatedly. The instrument sat silent now, its lid still open from Petrov's performance, the keys gleaming under the ballroom's lights. Several times, he caught the pianist watching him with a mixture of amusement and condescension, as if daring him to prove his earlier assertions about feeling and authenticity. The breaking point came during a conversation about music education and accessibility. Petrov was holding forth to a group that included several members of the Royal College of Music's faculty, discussing the decline of classical music appreciation among younger generations. The problem, Petrov was saying, gesturing expressively with his champagne glass, is that we've confused democratic access with lowered standards. Everyone believes they deserve a trophy for participation, rather than understanding that true excellence requires sacrifice and dedication that most people simply aren't willing to make. Professor Sarah Morrison from the Royal College nodded thoughtfully. But surely there's value in encouraging musical participation at all levels? Some of our greatest discoveries have come from unexpected sources. Petrov's smile was patronizing. Of course, encouraging participation is admirable. But we must be honest about the difference between participation and performance, between enthusiasm and artistry. When we pretend that wealth and access can substitute for genuine talent and years of serious study, we diminish the achievements of those who have truly earned their place in the musical world. Prince William, who had been standing just outside the group, found himself stepping forward. "You seem very certain about what constitutes genuine talent, Mr. Petrov." The pianist turned, his expression shifting to one of polite attention mixed with subtle challenge. "I've had the privilege of performing with the world's finest musicians, Your Highness. One develops an ear for authenticity. And, you believe authenticity can only emerge from specific circumstances?" William asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Not specific circumstances, exactly," Petrov replied, but from a particular relationship with the music. When someone has everything handed to them, when they've never had to struggle for their art or sacrifice anything meaningful to pursue it, how can they understand what it truly means to create something beautiful? The conversation around them had quieted again, and Catherine appeared at William's elbow with a concerned expression. She recognized the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of stillness that indicated her husband was approaching a decision that would have consequences. "You speak as if comfort and privilege automatically preclude depth of feeling," William observed. "Perhaps that reveals more about your assumptions than about the nature of musical understanding." Petrov's eyebrows rose slightly. "With all due respect, Your Highness, I speak from experience. I've seen too many well-meaning amateurs who believe that expensive lessons and quality instruments can substitute for the desperate need to express something that cannot be contained. Music isn't a parlor trick or a social accomplishment. It's a language that speaks to the deepest parts of human experience." "On that point, we're in complete agreement," William replied quietly. "Though I wonder if you might be mistaken about who has access to those deepest parts of human experience." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now, and several guests began to gather around the group, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Lord Ashworth looked increasingly uncomfortable, while Professor Morrison watched with the fascination of an academic observing an unexpected experiment. Petrov seemed to realize that the conversation had moved beyond theoretical discussion into something more personal and potentially dangerous. But, rather than backing down, his competitive nature and absolute certainty in his own worldview drove him forward. "Your Highness," he said with careful deliberation, "I mean no disrespect to your obvious love of music. But there's a difference between appreciating an art form and mastering it. The piano isn't just an instrument, it's a conduit for expressing things that words cannot capture. That kind of expression requires not just technical skill, but a depth of understanding that comes from living with music as the central focus of one's existence." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in a medieval court. Everyone present understood that Petrov was essentially stating that Prince William, regardless of his education or natural ability, could never truly understand music because of his privileged position and divided attention. William looked at the piano, its black surface reflecting the chandelier light like still water. When he turned back to Petrov, his expression had shifted from polite interest to something more focused and determined. "You make a compelling case for the connection between struggle and artistry," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made even the most distant conversations in the ballroom pause. "But perhaps you're limiting your definition of struggle to only external circumstances." "I'm not sure I understand," Petrov replied, though his tone suggested he understood perfectly and was preparing for whatever response he might receive. "Loss," William said simply. "Grief. The weight of expectations that can never be fully met. The knowledge that every choice you make affects not just yourself, but thousands of others. The inability to express certain emotions publicly, forcing you to find other outlets for feelings that might otherwise consume you. You speak as if poverty and uncertainty are the only sources of deep feeling, but perhaps you've never considered that privilege can be its own form of isolation." The silence that followed was profound. Every person in the group was acutely aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a member of the royal family speaking with unusual candor about the emotional cost of his position. Catherine's hand found her husband's arm, a gesture of support and solidarity. Petrov's expression had shifted from condescension to something more complex, surprise mixed with uncertainty and, perhaps the first hint of respect. "Your Highness," he said carefully, I hadn't considered that perspective." "No," William replied, "I don't imagine you had. You seem to have very fixed ideas about the relationship between circumstances and artistic authenticity. But, perhaps, before you dismiss someone's potential for genuine musical expression, you might consider asking them to demonstrate rather than simply assuming." The challenge was explicit now, and everyone present felt the weight of it. Petrov's eyes flicked to the piano, then back to William's face, clearly trying to determine whether the prince was actually suggesting what it sounded like he was suggesting. "Your Highness," Lord Ashworth interjected nervously, "perhaps we shouldn't know," William said firmly, his gaze never leaving Petrov's face. "I think Mr. Petrov has raised some interesting questions about the nature of musical authenticity and the relationship between circumstance and artistry. Perhaps it would be instructive to explore those questions more practically. Catherine stepped closer to her husband, her voice low but audible to those nearby. "William, are you certain about this?" He turned to her with a slight smile, the first genuine expression of warmth he had shown since the conversation began. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Turning back to Petrov, he gestured toward the piano. "You've made your position clear about the connection between struggle and authentic musical expression. You've also made it clear that you believe my circumstances preclude the possibility of genuine artistry. I propose we test that theory." Petrov's face had gone slightly pale. "Your Highness, I didn't intend to suggest." "Oh, but you did," William replied mildly. "You've spent the entire evening explaining why people like me cannot possibly understand music the way people like you do. You've made it clear that you consider royal patronage of the arts to be well-meaning but, ultimately hollow, because we lack the authentic experience necessary for true artistic expression." The gathering around them had grown larger now, as word of the exchange spread through the ballroom. Guests were positioning themselves to observe what was clearly about to become either a triumph or a disaster of epic proportions. "I think," William continued, "it would be educational for all of us to put your theories to a practical test. After all, if you're correct, then my performance will simply confirm everything you've said about the limitations of privileged dilettantes. And, if you're wrong." He let the sentence hang unfinished, its implications clear. Petrov looked around at the assembled crowd, clearly realizing that he had maneuvered himself into an impossible position. To back down now would be to admit that his dismissive comments had been inappropriate and, possibly, unfair. But, to continue forward was to risk being proven wrong in the most public and humiliating way possible. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "I would be honored to hear you play. Though I hope you understand that my observations were meant as general commentary on the state of classical music, not as personal criticism." "Of course," William replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe that for a moment. "Though I suspect your general observations will prove to be somewhat specific in their implications." He moved toward the piano with steady steps, his bearing calm and confident despite the fact that every eye in the ballroom was now focused on him. Catherine followed, taking a position where she could see both her husband and the assembled crowd, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. As William approached the instrument, the ballroom fell completely silent. Even the service staff had stopped their activities to observe what was about to unfold. The weight of expectation was palpable, electric with the possibility of either vindication or humiliation. William sat down at the bench and adjusted his position with the practiced movements of someone completely comfortable at the instrument. He placed his hands over the keys but didn't immediately begin to play, instead taking a moment to center himself and consider exactly what he wanted to communicate through his performance. Petrov stood nearby, his earlier confidence clearly shaken but his critical faculties still engaged. Whatever happened next, he would be evaluating every note, every phrase, every interpretive choice with the unforgiving scrutiny of a master musician who had built his reputation on technical perfection and artistic authenticity. The silence stretched, pregnant with possibility and tension, as Prince William prepared to prove that assumptions about privilege and musical understanding might be far more dangerous than anyone in the room had imagined. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of fabric as guests adjusted their positions to better observe what was about to unfold. Prince William sat at the piano bench with the composed stillness of someone who had spent years learning to function under intense scrutiny. But this was different from the countless public appearances and state functions he had endured throughout his life. This was personal. His hands remained poised above the keys as he considered his choice of repertoire. Everything would be communicated through this single performance, not just his technical ability, but his understanding of music as an emotional language. Petrov stood nearby, his expression a mixture of skepticism and genuine curiosity, clearly prepared to analyze every aspect of what was to come. Catherine watched from her position near the front of the assembled crowd, her face revealing the complex mixture of emotions she was experiencing. She knew her husband's musical abilities better than anyone else in the room, having heard him play during quiet moments at home, during family gatherings, and in the small private concerts they occasionally arranged for close friends. But she also understood the enormous risk he was taking. If the performance failed to meet the standards Petrov had set, it would not only be a personal humiliation but a public confirmation of everything the pianist had suggested about the limitations of royal dilettantes. William's choice, when it came, surprised everyone who knew anything about classical piano literature. Instead of selecting one of the more obvious showpieces that might demonstrate technical prowess, he placed his fingers on the keys and began the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was a piece that demanded not just technical mastery, but profound interpretive insight, a work that could easily reveal the difference between mere competence and genuine artistic understanding. The opening phrase emerged from the piano with a clarity and intentionality that immediately captured the room's attention. These were not the tentative notes of an amateur or the mechanically correct execution of someone playing from memory without understanding. William's interpretation revealed an intimate familiarity with the piece that went far beyond academic study. As the melody unfolded, it became clear that his approach to the ballade was deeply personal. Where Petrov's earlier performance had been technically flawless and emotionally compelling in a universal way, William's interpretation seemed to draw from some private well of experience. The lyrical sections sang with a vulnerability that was almost uncomfortable to witness, while the more dramatic passages carried a weight of authority that spoke to years of shouldering impossible responsibilities. Petrov's expression began to change within the first few measures. The skeptical condescension that had characterized his demeanor throughout the evening gave way to genuine surprise, then, to something approaching concern. This was not the performance of a wealthy dilettante playing at artistry. This was the voice of someone who understood music as a means of expressing things that could not be communicated any other way. The technical demands of the ballade were considerable, requiring precise fingerwork, sophisticated pedaling, and the ability to balance multiple melodic lines simultaneously. William navigated these challenges with an ease that suggested countless hours of practice, but, more importantly, his solutions to the piece's interpretive problems revealed deep musical intelligence. When he reached the development section, where Chopin's writing becomes most complex and emotionally turbulent, William's performance took on an intensity that made several listeners uncomfortable. The music seemed to channel years of suppressed emotion, the grief of losing his mother at a young age, the pressure of living constantly in the public eye, the weight of knowing that every personal choice would have public consequences. The piano became a vehicle for expressing feelings that royal protocol demanded he keep hidden, transforming Chopin's notes into a language more honest than any words he had ever spoken in public. Lord Ashworth found himself gripping the back of a chair, his knuckles white with tension. He had known William since childhood and had never suspected the depth of feeling that was now pouring forth through the music. The other guests stood transfixed, many of them experiencing the uncomfortable realization that they were witnessing something extraordinarily private despite being in a room full of people. Professor Morrison from the Royal College of Music felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had heard the ballade performed by world-renowned artists, but rarely had she experienced an interpretation that communicated such raw emotional honesty. Whatever technical imperfections might exist in William's performance, and she was finding precious few, they were completely overshadowed by the authenticity of his musical communication. Catherine watched her husband with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She was witnessing him reveal aspects of himself that he rarely shared even with her, using the piano as a confessional where he could finally express the full weight of his inner life. The music was beautiful, but it was also painful in its honesty, laying bare the emotional cost of a life lived in service to duty and tradition. As the ballade progressed through its various moods and sections, William's interpretation revealed an understanding of musical narrative that went far beyond technical training. He shaped phrases with the instinct of a natural storyteller, building tension and releasing it with the timing of someone who understood that music's power lay not just in beautiful sounds, but in the spaces between them. Petrov found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his fundamental assumptions challenged in the most public way possible. The man playing piano was not the dilettante he had imagined, not the wealthy amateur dabbling in serious art. This was a musician who understood the instrument as a means of communication, someone who had clearly spent years developing not just technical skill, but the interpretive insights that separated true artistry from mere competence. The pianist began to realize that his dismissive comments about royal patronage and privileged dilettantes had been based on prejudices rather than actual knowledge. He had assumed that wealth and social position would necessarily insulate someone from the kind of deep feeling that great music required, but the performance he was witnessing demonstrated exactly the opposite. Williams' music revealed depths of emotion and understanding that could only have come from genuine suffering and profound self-reflection. As the ballade approached its dramatic conclusion, Williams' performance seemed to transcend the physical limitations of the instrument. The final pages of Chopin's masterpiece emerged with a power and conviction that left no doubt about the performer's complete command of both the technical and emotional demands of the music. The climactic passages blazed with an intensity that seemed to burn away any remaining questions about his musical authenticity. When the last notes faded into silence, the ballroom remained completely still for several long moments. The performance had been so emotionally intense, so revealing of its performer's inner life, that the usual immediate applause seemed inadequate and almost inappropriate. It was as if everyone present needed time to process what they had just witnessed. Prince William remained seated at the piano bench, his hands resting in his lap, his expression calm but somehow transformed. The act of musical expression had clearly taken something out of him, but had also given him something in return. He looked around the room at the faces of his guests, meeting their eyes with a quiet confidence that hadn't been present before his performance. Petrov stood frozen in place, his face pale with the realization of how profoundly he had misjudged both the man and the situation. The performance he had just heard was not just technically accomplished, it was artistically mature in ways that challenged everything he had said about the relationship between privilege and authentic musical expression. Catherine was the first to move, stepping forward and beginning to applaud with slow, deliberate claps that gradually grew in intensity. Her ovation seemed to break the spell that had held the room, and other guests began to join in until the ballroom erupted in sustained applause that went far beyond polite appreciation. But, even as the room filled with the sound of acclaim, all eyes remained focused on the confrontation that everyone knew was still to come. Petrov had thrown down a challenge based on his assumptions about privilege and artistry, and William had responded in the most direct way possible. Now the pianist would have to acknowledge what he had heard and reconcile it with everything he had said earlier in the evening. As the applause gradually subsided, William rose from the piano bench and turned to face Petrov directly. The two men looked at each other across a distance that seemed to encompass not just the few feet of ballroom floor between them, but the entire gulf between assumption and reality, between prejudice and understanding. "Well, Mr. Petrov," William said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room, "what do you think? Have I demonstrated the kind of authentic musical expression you believe can only come from struggle and sacrifice? Or am I still just a wealthy dilettante playing at artistry?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over the pianist's head. Everyone present understood that his response would determine not just the outcome of their personal confrontation, but his own credibility as an artist and critic. There could be no diplomatic evasion, no graceful retreat into politeness. The performance had been too powerful, too emotionally honest, to be dismissed or minimized. Petrov opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find words that could adequately address what he had just experienced. His entire worldview had been challenged by 20 minutes of music, and the comfortable certainties that had defined his approach to artistry lay in ruins around him. The silence stretched, pregnant with tension and possibility, as one of the world's most celebrated pianists prepared to confront the reality that his assumptions about privilege, authenticity, and the sources of artistic truth had been completely and spectacularly wrong. The silence that followed Prince William's challenge seemed to stretch for an eternity. Alexander Petrov stood motionless, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions as he struggled to process what he had just witnessed. The performance he had heard was not merely technically accomplished, it was artistically profound in ways that shattered every assumption he had made about the relationship between privilege and authentic musical expression. Finally, Petrov took a slow, deliberate breath and stepped forward. His movement seemed to release the tension that had held the entire room in suspended animation. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of the confident authority that had characterized all his previous statements. "Your Royal Highness," he began, then paused, clearly struggling to find adequate words. I must offer you my most sincere apology." The admission sent a ripple through the assembled crowd. Many had expected diplomatic evasion or professional courtesy, but Petrov's tone suggested something far more significant was about to unfold. "I came here tonight," he continued, his accent seeming more pronounced in his emotional state, "believing I understood the nature of musical authenticity. I thought I knew where true artistry could be found and where it could not. I was arrogant, presumptuous, and..." He paused again, visibly gathering himself. "I was completely wrong." Prince William remained standing beside the piano, his expression carefully neutral as he waited for Petrov to continue. Catherine moved closer to her husband, her presence offering silent support while her eyes never left the pianist's face. "What I heard just now," Petrov said, his voice growing stronger, "was not the performance of an amateur or a dilettante. It was the voice of someone who understands music as a language for expressing the inexpressible. Your interpretation of the Chopin Ballade demonstrated not just technical mastery, but the kind of emotional intelligence and artistic maturity that I have encountered in only the finest musicians of my generation." Lord Ashworth released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, while Professor Morrison nodded slowly, her own professional judgment confirming everything Petrov was acknowledging. "But, more than that," the pianist continued, "your performance has forced me to confront my own prejudices and limitations. I built my understanding of artistic authenticity on a foundation of assumptions about suffering and struggle, never considering that depth of feeling and genuine artistic insight could emerge from experiences very different from my own." He moved closer to William, his posture now one of respect rather than challenge. "When you spoke of loss, grief, and the weight of expectations, I dismissed it as an attempt to claim equivalence between our experiences. I couldn't see past my own narrow definition of what constitutes genuine struggle. But your music just demonstrated that the sources of artistic truth are far more complex and varied than I had ever imagined." The crowd watched in fascination as one of the world's most celebrated musicians publicly acknowledged not just his misjudgment of Prince William's abilities, but his fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of artistic authenticity itself. "The isolation you described," Petrov continued, "the inability to express certain emotions publicly, the weight of responsibility for others' lives and well-being, these are indeed forms of struggle, perhaps more profound than anything I have experienced. And the music you just played communicated that struggle with an honesty and depth that moved me in ways I didn't think were still possible." Prince William's expression softened slightly, though he remained alert and focused on the pianist's words. This was clearly more than a simple acknowledgement of musical competence, it was a fundamental reconsideration of beliefs that had shaped Petrov's entire approach to his art. "I realize now," Petrov said, "that my comments about royal patronage and privileged dilettantes were not just inappropriate, they were born from a kind of intellectual arrogance that prevented me from recognizing authentic artistry when it didn't fit my preconceived notions. You have shown me that true musical understanding can indeed emerge from circumstances very different from those I had considered valid." He paused, looking around at the assembled guests before returning his attention to William. "But, perhaps most importantly, your performance has reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. It wasn't because of the struggle or sacrifice, it was because of music's unique ability to communicate truth in ways that words cannot. Tonight, you used that language to speak truths that challenged everything I thought I knew about artistry and authenticity." The sincerity in Petrov's voice was unmistakable, and many of the guests found themselves moved by his willingness to so publicly acknowledge his error. This was not a diplomatic apology designed to smooth over social awkwardness, it was the honest admission of a serious artist who had been forced to confront the limitations of his own worldview. Prince William studied the pianist's face for a long moment before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that had been absent throughout most of the evening's confrontation. "Thank you, Mr. Petrov. Your willingness to reconsider your position speaks well of your character as both an artist and a person. Though I must say, your original performance tonight was indeed extraordinary. The technical mastery and emotional communication you demonstrated in the Chopin Sonata were genuinely inspiring." The gracious response seemed to surprise Petrov, who had perhaps expected continued confrontation or at least a pointed reminder of his earlier dismissive comments. "You're very kind, Your Highness," he replied. "Though I suspect my technical perfection pales in comparison to the emotional honesty you brought to your performance. There's a difference between playing all the right notes and speaking from the heart, and tonight you reminded me which one ultimately matters more." Catherine stepped forward slightly, her own relief at the turn of events evident in her expression. Perhaps, she suggested gently, this experience demonstrates that authentic artistry can emerge from many different paths, and that our understanding of music is enriched when we remain open to those possibilities. Professor Morrison nodded enthusiastically. Indeed, Your Royal Highness. This evening has been a masterclass in the complexity of musical expression and the dangers of limiting our definitions of what constitutes authentic artistry. But Petrov wasn't finished with his reconsideration. There's something else I need to acknowledge, he said, turning back to Prince William. The assumptions I made tonight weren't just about musical ability, they reflected a broader prejudice about wealth, privilege, and the supposed immunity it provides from genuine suffering. Your music forced me to recognize that emotional depth and artistic insight aren't limited to those who have experienced poverty or social struggle. He paused, his expression becoming more thoughtful. In fact, I realize now that my own comfort with my success as a musician, the financial security and recognition I've achieved, should have made me more sensitive to the possibility that others with advantages might also possess genuine artistic understanding. My hypocrisy was as profound as my misjudgment. The conversation was beginning to attract renewed attention from guests who had started to drift away after the initial confrontation seemed resolved. The philosophical implications of what was being discussed, questions about the sources of artistic authenticity and the relationship between circumstance and creative truth, were too compelling to ignore. Lord Ashworth, emboldened by the increasingly collegial atmosphere, ventured his own observation. This has been quite illuminating for all of us, I think. It suggests that our cultural assumptions about art and privilege may need more careful examination. Absolutely, agreed a music critic who had been observing the entire exchange with professional fascination. We often assume that struggle and authenticity are necessarily connected, but perhaps we're conflating different kinds of challenges and experiences. Prince William listened to the developing discussion with evident satisfaction, but also with the awareness that the evening's events had accomplished something beyond personal vindication. The confrontation with Petrov had opened up larger questions about how society evaluates artistic merit and the biases that shape those evaluations. What I find most interesting, William observed, is how easily we can mistake external circumstances for internal reality. Mr. Petrov's assumptions about my musical understanding were based on visible aspects of my life, my position, my responsibilities, my apparent advantages. But music, at its core, is about internal experience and the ability to translate that experience into sound. Petrov nodded vigorously. Yes, exactly. I was judging the music before hearing it, based on everything except the music itself. It's a fundamental betrayal of everything I claim to believe about artistic evaluation. Catherine smiled at the irony. It seems appropriate that this understanding emerged through a musical performance rather than through discussion or argument. Music has a way of cutting through our intellectual preconceptions and speaking directly to truth. The evening was beginning to wind down, but the energy around the piano area remained high as guests continued to process what they had witnessed. Several musicians in attendance had approached William to express their admiration for his performance, while others engaged Petrov in conversations about the broader implications of the evening's revelations. As the crowd gradually thinned, Petrov approached Prince William for a more private conversation. Your Highness, he said quietly, I wonder if I might ask about your musical training? Your technique and interpretation tonight suggested years of serious study. William smiled, appreciating the genuine musical curiosity behind the question. I'd been fortunate to work with some exceptional teachers over the years. Professor Margaret Hanley was particularly influential during my teens and early 20s. She helped me understand that technical facility was only the beginning of musical expression. Hanley trained you? Petrov's eyebrows rose with surprise and respect. She's legendary in professional circles. Her students consistently demonstrate the kind of interpretive insight you showed tonight. Yes, though our lessons were often interrupted by royal obligations, William replied with slight humor. She used to joke that I was probably the only student she'd ever had who missed lessons due to state dinners and international tours. This revelation seemed to complete something for Petrov, providing the final piece of understanding about how genuine musical education could coexist with royal duties. That explains so much about your performance tonight. Henley wouldn't have continued working with you if you hadn't demonstrated real talent and commitment. The two men continued talking about music, teachers, and repertoire as the ballroom gradually emptied. What had begun as confrontation had transformed into the kind of collegial discussion that often emerges between serious musicians who recognize kindred spirits in one another. As the evening finally drew to a close, Petrov made one final observation that seemed to capture the significance of what had transpired. Tonight has reminded me that music's greatest power lies not in confirming our existing beliefs, but in challenging them. Your performance didn't just demonstrate musical ability, it forced everyone present to reconsider fundamental assumptions about artistry, authenticity, and the complex relationship between life experience and creative expression. Prince William nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson any of us can learn, that truth often emerges from the places we least expect to find it, and that our preconceptions, however well-intentioned, can blind us to possibilities we hadn't imagined. As the guests departed and the ballroom returned to quiet elegance, the echoes of the evening's music seemed to linger in the air. What had begun as a simple cultural gathering had become something far more significant, a reminder that authentic artistry transcends social categories and that the capacity for profound musical expression can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. The confrontation between Prince William and Alexander Petrov had revealed not just the dangers of assumption and prejudice, but the transformative power of music to communicate truths that challenge our most fundamental beliefs about talent, authenticity, and the sources of artistic understanding. In the end, both men had been changed by the encounter, one humbled by the recognition of his misjudgments, the other affirmed in his belief that music could serve as a bridge between the private self and the public role that duty demanded.